Yeah, thank you very much. Please tell me if you can't hear me down the back. I'm not particularly loud, so if my voice drops away, just wave at me or something, because I know how frustrating it can be not to be able to hear. So, as Philippe has said, this is a paper about retirement savings. This paper is quite different from the ones that we've seen this morning, because what it does is look at a change in policy. Rather than trying to analyse data and create models that might inform policy, what this paper does is look at what happens when policy changes and then tries to understand that descriptively and then ask some questions about people's behaviour. I think this paper raises many more questions than it answers, and I think that at the end of this you'll understand why. But I do think it's important for us to take a close look at what governments do around the settings of retirement savings, and this example is quite an interesting one. So this is joint work with my colleagues Hazel Bateman, Isabella Debrescu and Ben Newell from the University of New South Wales, and Jun Hao Liu, who was a postdoc at the University of Sydney at the time we did this work. The work is funded by the Australian Research Council, and I need to acknowledge them, but I also want to acknowledge that the data that we have primarily was supplied to us by one of the major pension plans in Australia called CBUS, which I'll explain to you a little bit more about. I'll explain a little bit more about them to you in a little while. They service primarily the construction sector in Australia, which makes our results interesting, but in some senses not as general as they might otherwise be. So the question that we're addressing in this paper is to study the motivations and the thinking behind people's reasoning for withdrawing their retirement savings early at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. So just as a little bit of background, and if with Glenn's permission, I might allow some clarification questions early in this session, because you may have questions about the Australian pension system as we go through. Much of this might not make sense if you don't ask a burning question. So in Australia, the retirement savings system has a typical three pillars. There's a means-tested age pension that is a safety net. It's not earnings-linked. There is then a second pillar, which is an earnings-linked mandatory contribution system called superannuation, which is why this is called the Superannuation COVID-19 Early Release Scheme. And that takes around 10% of earnings from a worker's pay packet and contributes it into an individual defined contribution account. And on the whole, there are some exceptions. There are very few defined benefit accounts remaining, but mainly defined contribution accounts. And those funds are invested and they are preserved, quite strictly preserved in the past, until a certain age, which varies a little bit depending on when you were born, but roughly speaking is around the age of 60. If you retire at 60, you can withdraw the funds. Prior to that, withdrawing any funds is extremely difficult and administratively arduous and is taxed. It's a very difficult thing to take your superannuation out, and the reasons have to be related to, for example, terminal illness or extreme hardship. You have to make a very strong case. Now, during the COVID-19 pandemic, one of the first, I think possibly the first, fiscal stimulus that the Australian government announced was to change access to those superannuation savings, to retirement savings, and allow pension plan participants to remove $10,000 from their accounts in 2 tranches over the course of 1 financial year. So prior to this announcement, basically no access to your savings in your pension plan. After this announcement, $20,000 available to you over the course of 12 months, and it was extremely straightforward. There was no process involved. You simply went to a website, clicked on a couple of links, and the money was made available to you within 5 working days. There were some eligibility rules, which I'll get to in a minute. Now, so we're studying that. We think this is a really interesting change in the liquidity status of a retirement savings system, which is a question that's being widely debated. But the question that I'd really like to pose to you as we go through this presentation for thinking about in the background is, do you think this is good policy? Okay, do you think this is good policy? So what we find is that that most withdrawers made the decision to withdraw the money from their account quite quickly. The $10,000, which was an upper limit, of course, on the amount that they could withdraw, actually also appeared to work as an anchor in people's thinking about how much to take out. It was also true that both immediate needs and future concerns for people's welfare were the main drivers for withdrawing the funds. And depending on how you think about this question, and this is a debatable statement, I'm sure there will be debate about this, we estimate that about 17% of the people in our sample who withdrew made a reasonable estimate of what the impact of their withdrawal would be. So this is up for dispute. How do I get the? Is there a light? Is there a laser?
Sure.
Not really. Just a clicker. Okay. So as I said, there's a discussion going on in the literature at the moment around optimal liquidity in retirement savings. John Bashirs has written some papers, this group from Columbia also, have looked at how much illiquidity is ideal in a retirement savings system. And basically the argument depends on whether you think the population is generally present biased or not. And the results pretty much show that if you think the population has some heterogeneous degree of present bias, there are arguments in favour of making retirement accounts illiquid. And in Bashirs' paper, for example, that level of liquidity is quite small. So, at least 90% completely illiquid and then a small percent liquid. There's also work that relates to concerns about leakages from accounts, and those of you who are familiar with 401k account literature would know the debate that's gone on around the benefits or otherwise of leakage and borrowing from 401k accounts. And there's an empirical literature that is also emerging on cross-country differences between degrees of liquidity in retirement savings accounts.
Susan, just a methodological clarification. The early comment about rational illiquidity, you said, let me paraphrase, if you believe there's a sufficient heterogeneity in present bias, then there's a case to be made for making, is there a normative case? Or what's the normative status?
So you could make a normative case if you go back to Peter Diamond's sort of original papers on pensions. His argument is that once the government provides social security support or targeted income support in old age, once social insurance comes into play, some level of mandatory retirement savings is justified in those situations because people have incentives not to save. So there are other normative reasons. This literature is the real reason for it's hard to get a story in favour of illiquidity if everybody's a perfectly rational planner.
No, I get all that. I'm trying to get the normative economics clean here. If individuals have a bias, we're saying it's therefore a good policy to pander to that bias. Let me try to overstate it. That just sounds bad normative economics to me.
Okay, well, take it up with John. Okay, so let's think about some of the other practicalities here. Just before we go on, everybody's sort of sufficiently clear about the way that the preservation stuff works. Okay, so there was a discussion and there is a literature emerging about who decided to withdraw from their retirement savings accounts during this period of time, and several different papers addressing this in different jurisdictions. Withdrawers, unsurprisingly, tend to be people who have relatively low levels of non-retirement wealth. All the work that's been done in Australia by the administrative organisations, by the regulators, using banking data supports those types of findings. Other papers suggest that this is related to low financial literacy. That's not something we can identify in our data, and we don't make any statements about it. There's some evidence that financial knowledge over confidence is a factor, and these Last factors being younger, poorer, lower income, and more likely to be behind by debt payments. These emerged from work that my co-author Ben Newell did with another of his colleagues, Nathan Wang Lee, where they studied transaction data from one of the major banks where they could identify people who had withdrawn their retirement savings early, and they basically showed that looking at that bank data indicated that many of the early release people fell into these categories. So basically exactly who you would expect were identified in the bank data as being people who were more likely to have withdrawn from their retirement savings. We have some other data. The broader cross-section of administrative data also suggests that people withdrew for other reasons, and I'm sure those of us in the room can think of reasons why we might like to take $20,000 out of our pension plan and do something else with it. So there are other people who were taking that opportunity that have been documented as well. So in terms of factors being related to early withdrawal, the obvious reason to do this, and the one that the government promoted, was that people would be needing money to cover themselves for the consumption smoothing that they would experience during job loss or reduced work hours during the COVID pandemic, and this has been discussed in other literature as well. And then the one that we focus on a little bit more in this study, which relates to basically precautionary liquidity. So one of the reasons that people withdrew their money from the savings accounts was anticipation of future trouble, not experience of immediate trouble. Okay, now this is a quote from our then Prime Minister, a slightly inarticulate Scott Morrison, who basically used this statement to change the framing of retirement savings in Australia. So superannuation, retirement savings, is their money. When they need it at a time in a pandemic, we're going to make sure they can get access to it. So the framing of this policy was very strongly around the ownership of the money by the individual account holder. This is your money, you should be able to get it out. I won't make you guess which side of politics it comes from. That government's been replaced. Okay, in terms of the early release background, just to go over a few details, just to get this really clear for everybody, it was announced in March 2020, right at the beginning of the pandemic, literally the first thing that happened policy-wise in Australia, and it gave people access from April the 20th until December the 31st of 2020, and you could withdraw in two tranches. One tranche of $10,000 in the first half of the year and one tranche of $10,000 in the second half of the year. And remember that this is individual, so a couple household could withdraw up to $40,000 from their accounts, and some of them did. In terms of eligibility, there was stated eligibility criteria that you can read here. Unemployed, receiving a social security payment, made redundant or having working hours reduced, or having your business either suspended or having turnover reduced by at least 20%. Now, these are, perfectly reasonable eligibility criteria, but the thing to bear in mind is that no one was checking. So when you went to the tax office and said, I want to take my money out, you stated that this was true of you, and occasionally there were sort of semi-threats made in the background about paying too much tax if it's not true of you. But there was really no punishment if you withdrew without being eligible, and there was really no way of checking. So in some ways, the big surprise here is why more people did not withdraw from their retirement savings accounts, though a substantial number did, and I think more than the government was expecting. So as I said, I've been through the $10,000. Now, when I say a low-friction application process, most Australians have an online account that gives them access to government services. So once you've logged into that online account, you clicked on the tax office site, you clicked on a sign that said, do you want to take your superannuation out? You said yes, and then they put the money in your account in 5 days.
Did the government offer any other financial support during the pandemic?
Absolutely they did. I think that's a bit further along. I'm not sure whether I've got the slide in here that goes through it. Yes, so lots of other stimulus payments. There was a doubling of the payment for unemployment insurance payment, so that went from a certain number to twice as much. And then the big fiscal support was one that was common across many countries, which was what that in Australia was labelled as JobKeeper, but was basically finance provided to businesses who had to put their workers off in order to keep paying their workers. So that was by far the largest fiscal measure, but this one was right up there. Yeah. There were other things. The point about the early release was it was first. That's the first thing that happened.
Question.
Yeah. Sure.
No, I was going to mention this for a minute. So prior to the reform, were you able to access these funds, or you just paid a tax penalty?
It's extremely difficult to access your funds. Yeah, you had to be terminally ill or suffering extreme hardship, and you had to make a case, and those funds were taxed when you withdrew them.
And in the case of medical hardship, you needed to provide documentation. So just to clarify, because was there much discussion in Australia about these are just mock eligibility, or was it presented as you must indeed, so people knew that?
Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah. You can imagine that went quickly. Yeah.
I probably should know the answer to this, but
Go, Todd.
there was a $10,000 limit in each round. Did you have to do that in one? Like, could you take out twice within each, or did you have to do it like all at once?
Yeah. No, I don't think you had to do it all at once.
So you could take like 5 now and then 5. Right at the end of the window.
That's a really great. I've never actually looked at the data to. I don't know of anybody who actually did that.
No, I believe that was the case because we were doing the aged care pension, and so that was you were allowed to, but almost nobody did.
Almost nobody did.
And it's not taxable? Is that true?
It wasn't taxed. Yeah, it wasn't taxed on the way out.
Tax-free?
Tax-free.
And there's no rule to put it back at any point.
And you can put it back. You've got until 2030 to put it back tax-free.
Yeah.
That's only been announced recently.
Or you could hang on to it in tax.
Or you could invest it, and then you would pay tax. Yeah.
Okay.
On income, but not on the capital. So this is to give you an idea of the scale. So numbers always look small to people from North America when they're coming from Australia, but this is 18% of all plan participants who withdrew from their plans, so a lot. $37 billion, which is 1% of the total assets of the superannuation system, which is about $3 trillion. Average withdrawals of 7,638, and 49% of people withdrew in both rounds. And you have to remember that a large proportion of people took out everything they had in the first round, so their capacity to withdraw in the second round was eliminated. This is actually, it was, as I said, the second largest COVID stimulus policy that the government instituted, and among the largest fiscal stimulus policies that we've ever seen in Australia. So second after the JobKeeper income support, this was a very significant amount. $38 billion was quite a large amount. Now, you can see on the graph in the bottom, I'm not sure if those down the back can see too well, but this lists the reasons that people gave on the official government site for why they had withdrawn. And you can see that 44% chose that they'd had a reduction in their working hours as the main reason that they were withdrawing. Some were actually unemployed or eligible for a government benefit at the time, but had a reduction in working hours is an interesting. It would have been true for many people. It's also true, I think, for the many people who weren't really quite eligible, but thought that one day they might be. So this is really very bad econometrics on this slide, but bear with me because it's illustrative.
Just a quick institutional question. So if there is, so someone who suffers a reduction in number of hours, are they eligible for unemployment insurance?
No, you have to be unemployed to be eligible for unemployment insurance.
So underemployed people are not eligible for unemployment insurance?
Underemployed people are generally, I'm not sure of the exact rules, but basically you have to not have a job. Yeah, there'd probably be other income support for you. So on the left-hand side axis and the stepwise line, the light grey line, you can see the unemployment rate, the realised unemployment rate, over the course of this time period in the prior year. And then the dark line, the black line, is, and on the right-hand side axis, is showing you the number of withdrawals at particular points in time. And you can see that there are two very, very distinct peaks in the withdrawal level, and they coincide with the opening of the scheme in April and then the turn of the financial year in June. So the 2 points at which the timing allowed people to make these withdrawals were associated with the largest increase in applications. The thing to notice is that it's not very closely related to the tapering movements of the unemployment rate. Now, of course, you didn't have to be unemployed to get this. So the super fund that we study in this example mainly, we do take one data set from outside this retirement plan, is a profit for members or a not-for-profit fund. As I said, primarily the construction sector. In total, it has about 770,000 members, $52 billion in assets under administration, which is not the largest fund by any stretch, but it's a reasonably large fund by Australian standards. And what we collect from CBUS is administrative data, demographics related to the people, their membership generally, and the early release scheme. They surveyed 3,000 members who had withdrawn the money under the early release scheme. We didn't have complete control over that survey. That was administered by the plan itself. And then in order to get a little bit more leverage over the meaning of the data, we separately collected a control sample of 500 people who were pension plan members but not members of this plan. And we looked at people who were eligible to withdraw but had decided not to. So you can imagine in our logistic regression, the 3,000 members who decide to withdraw are ones and the people in the control sample are zeros, right? Okay, so just to give you some idea of how this was utilised and how our data is and is not representative of the sector, you can see here membership of CBUS on the very left-hand side column, and the percentage of members who withdrew were 24%. As compared with the industry-wide average of 15%. Now, the 4 columns here on the right show you 2 plans that are quite similar to CBUS in that these sectors were very affected by the pandemic, and 2 funds that were dissimilar in that the membership of those plans were mainly public service employees like teachers and police who had quite secure employment during the COVID pandemic. And you can see that there's a much smaller percentage of withdrawers in the securely employed plans than there were in CBUS. So we have a group of people in CBUS who feel more under threat and who may be experiencing more reductions in income related to the pandemic, and they're quite similar to retail and hospitality workers. It's also worth noting that the average amount withdrawn is slightly higher in the fund that we study compared with others. So we're interested in how they thought about this decision, why they withdrew it, how much they thought about the consequences, and what the estimated impact was. So our summary statistics, again, highlight similarities and differences in our samples. So the construction sector plan is 90% male and 10% female in membership, so very non-representative in terms of gender spread. And I think looking at the aggregate data, I think men were slightly more likely in general to withdraw from their retirement plans than women were. In terms of age and withdrawal amounts, the CBUS membership are quite similar to others, and you can see that across the different rounds. So across the different rounds, people withdrew about the same amount in each round at about $8,000. Now, as I said, we also collected a sample in a control survey of 500 people who said they were eligible to withdraw but had not. Much higher representation of females in the control sample, but otherwise on these observables fairly similar. Okay, now in terms of account balances, the other thing to look at here is that a big difference between the CBUS membership and the control survey is the average account balance, and I can show you how that matters as we move through the results. But basically, the people in CBUS have slightly lower than average account balances compared with the remainder of the industry, but quite similar at the median. Okay, so what happened in terms of how much money people took out? This in some ways is the most important graph, and though it's possibly not the easiest to see what's going on. Okay, so relative to the $10,000 limit that I've got to say the government just seemed to pull out of the air, there was no economic reasoning around that number, it was just a round number, and something that most people, I guess, could meet. What you can see is that a very large proportion of people took the full $10,000 out, but they still had more than $1,000 remaining in their account. So these are people who were hitting a boundary possibly in some sense. Either $10,000 was enough for them, or they would have taken more but they couldn't because of the upper bound, and they had money left in their accounts. The other interesting group here are those who took less than $10,000 and had less than $1,000 left in their account. So that group of people here in the 18.5% group withdrew nearly everything that they could. And they appear to be a group of people for whom the account balance was an upper bound. So had they had $10,000 or more, they probably would have taken it. And then there is a small group of people, only about 11%, who actually took less than $10,000 and had more than $1,000 left. There's a lot here we can't see, but what we appear to be seeing is that the $10,000 limit that the government imposed was very salient and important to the way that the policy worked. Now, when we asked people about why they withdrew, and these data are from our survey, but there are ABS data that the Australian Bureau of Statistics collected as well in a much more structured and systematic survey that basically reinforce our results. So basically, most people said that they were withdrawing because they were immediately concerned about maintaining their consumption, but around a quarter, slightly more than a quarter, said that they were withdrawing funds because they were worried about things that were going to happen next. So future concerns were a really important driver here. This emerges from other data sets as well. Very few people said, I want the money because I don't trust the superannuation fund to invest it properly during the pandemic, and very few people said, I just want the money now. Yeah. So maybe they were partly affected by, the eligibility criteria or concerned about this. Where did you find out about it? It was all over everywhere. There was no escaping this information in Australia. It was on the newspapers. It was on all the news reports. People got it through the news and social media. And in terms of other information, the fund itself was very interested in understanding which information people used in making this decision, because they were mainly concerned about their own internal communications at this stage.
I have a question. This money was not in the stock market, or was it?
Oh, was, yeah.
Oh, so they took it when it had dropped 30%.
They did. A lot of them.
Okay.
Yeah. So most of these funds are invested in strategic asset allocation that's 70% growth, 30% defensive, with a very high exposure to risky assets. That's typical, and almost all of these funds would have come from there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Did the super fund campaign against people taking it out?
No, they weren't allowed to.
Right.
They had to be incredibly careful about what they said, because the regulator was watching them like a hawk to make sure that there was nothing negative said. So that it was interesting being in meetings with the member services people, because they were just walking this tightrope between the trustees who were saying don't encourage anybody to take any money out of our plan, and the regulator who was saying don't discourage anyone from taking any money out of your plan. So it was a really tricky situation, and they were super careful about what they said, but they certainly didn't discourage anybody. It was really just, this is how you do it, this is what's going to happen. But they did offer people information about what their estimate of the consequences for retirement would be. Yeah. So,
and were they,
sorry, go ahead.
I don't know the timing and I don't remember, but could it be that they were worried that it would keep on dropping?
I'm sure lots of people were worried that it would keep on dropping.
So maybe they took it out not because they needed it, just because they didn't want to keep on dropping? Or
so they would also have been, and people did do this, be able to move there easily within the fund into cash.
Okay.
Yeah.
But that's where the consequences of retirement that you'll get to are really important, how that was explained.
Yes, it is, yeah. So, though perhaps not very important.
No.
Anyway, so basically this graph try and look at all the columns that are not tall and add them up, because they tell you that most people thought about this decision for less than a week. And we saw that on the graph before with that big swing in the withdrawal. So the amount of thinking time was very low. A small, almost half said that they did think about this for longer than a week. This is a really large chunk of retirement savings for most people. The median account balance is $50,000. This is taking out 20% of your retirement savings, and if you're a household, probably a larger percentage, and you're going to give it not very much thought. Okay, then this gets to Glenn's point about what we think of impact on future wealth. So if we set this a multiple choice question in an exam, A, B, C, D as possible answers, and we got that graph back from student responses, we'd probably ditch that question, right, as being non-discriminating, because the response spread looks pretty random across the possibilities that are available to you here. So when we ask people to estimate, we've offered them generous intervals around what they thought this withdrawal of their funds might mean for their retirement savings. Basically, a lot of them said, I don't know, and I'm not worried about it either. So you could say I don't know and I don't care. That falls into the others category. About 20% underestimated, about 30% overestimated, and about 17% got we thought within a reasonable range of the impact. Now, this is a very tricky question to ask and to answer, because there's a lot of things going on in people's heads when they see this. They're thinking, maybe I'm going to recontribute this. Maybe I'll save this back in and it won't take me very long, when things get better. So we really don't know exactly how they did the calculation, but the spread of responses and the fact that we've got 30% of people saying, I haven't even attempted to calculate this, and anyway, even if I had, I wouldn't know what it was, suggests that there's a significant number of people who are making this decision without really getting the implications of what they're doing.
Or it just means that you didn't ask a question where they could tell you the low lack of confidence on answering this, like allocating 100 tokens.
Yes, it would have been good to ask them about a confidence interval. I totally agree. And no, you're right, Glenn, that would have been an excellent question to include. We had pretty much no control over the content of the survey. So what did you do with the money? Well, again, this matches data that we've seen from other places. So a lot of people did spend the money for fairly immediate concerns. About 30% of it saved, 30% saved, which fits the picture of people who are anticipating trouble in the future. Debt repayment, investment, medical needs, helping family and friends. So what you'd expect. And as I said, there have been several studies since using bank transaction data and survey work done by the Australian Tax Office, also by the Australian Bureau of Statistics, that does suggest that most of the money was used to meet consumption needs and pay the bills and to pay down debt. However, we do also observe very large increases in discretionary spending among the group of people who took this out. So yes, they bought the groceries and they paid their credit card debt, and they had a bit of a flutter on the online gambling as well, and they bought a new telly. Yeah. Okay. So let's try and sort of do this.
So Australia gambling is called spending.
Yes. Yeah, there's work to be done there. I'm sure you're engaged with it, Glenn. So this decision to withdraw. We're going to model the decision to withdraw by comparing the sample that the plan took of their members and the sample that we took of people outside the plan who were members of other plan but who had decided not to withdraw. Okay, so in terms of predictive margins, what we can see is that that the importance of future concerns really comes into play here. So one of the main increases in the likelihood of taking the money out is this concern about facing future expenses. Now, if you think about the beginning of the pandemic, this is a perfectly logical response from people. None of us knew what was going to happen. It looked like the world could end. So it's really not clear what was going to happen. So if the government says, I'm going to let you take $10,000 out just in case seems like a really good plan at that point in time. It's 3 percentage points higher if they didn't think about the consequences or were not sure. So that's more of a worry. That's saying, well, it would be we know that you're unclear about the future. So that anxiety and then the related uncertainty perhaps spills across into the decision making itself. And then we're looking at 4 percentage points higher if they underestimate the impact or they don't know or don't care. So you're more likely to withdraw if you haven't thought about much. You're more likely to withdraw if you think the effect is likely to be small or you really don't care what the effect is at all. And then if you're in that mid-age group, 40 to 49, you are more likely to withdraw. And that's probably related to the demands of that age, demands on income in that age group. Okay, and then this regression models the probability of withdrawing the maximum amount. And in this model, we define the maximum amount as either the $10,000 upper bound or everything in your account so that there's less than $1,000 left, right? So your account boundary or the $10,000 boundary, and we use the administrative data to run this model. So the likelihood of withdrawing the maximum account is actually higher if you have a balance. That's high, that makes sense. And it's also higher if you're, interestingly, in the higher salary quintiles. So if you were, in one framework, if you were thinking that people were doing this on the basis of need, you might sort of think the reverse outcome, that the wealthier people and the higher income people are likely to be in less need for these emergency funds. That's possible. We find the reverse. So the people that had capacity withdrew the full amount of the of what they could from their retirement savings account. Then tenure, which is very closely related to age, and higher if aged in that middle age range again. Okay, so just to sum up here, temporary release of retirement savings in Australia. This policy was designed to meet immediate consumption needs of Australians at the beginning of the pandemic, and it's certainly true in the data that we have and in other studies that a lot of people withdrew for that reason, but also because they were uncertain about the future. So not for immediate consumption smoothing, but anticipating a need. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so is there a gender differential? And within a household, were women more likely to take it out versus men?
Yeah, I think at the aggregate level, I think men were more likely to withdraw more. They also hold higher balances on average. So I'd have to do a conditioning households. We included gender in our models, but it didn't matter. But as I've said at the beginning, I'm cautious about saying much about gender in our sample because our sample is so male. Yeah, so I wouldn't want to push too hard on that. Yeah. We also show that I think that the anchoring on $10,000 is actually a really important comment on policy. And we also show here, I think, with reasonable justification that poor estimates and less thinking did make people more likely to withdraw than more thinking and better estimation. And unsurprisingly, in some ways, older, relatively wealthier members are more likely to withdraw to the maximum, but at the same time, they're less likely to be actually liquidity constrained. So again, you get this driver towards taking as much liquidity as is available to you. So could there be tax benefits for withdrawing? It's hard to answer that question except at the individual level, and it also depends on how skilled an investor a person assesses themselves to be. So the benefits of having your money in the retirement savings vehicle depend on if you want to take it out and invest it, right? Obviously, if you've got immediate debt, immediate consumption needs, there are benefits. But in terms, if you don't have those and you're looking at this as a tax arbitrage, then the tax arbitrage depends on what you can earn when you withdraw the money. Because if you invest it, you will pay tax on those earnings at your marginal income tax rate. And also you have to be as good an investor as the pension fund. And the pension funds are good investors. They get excellent rates of return. So it would be hard to beat the fund for tax reasons. And then just getting back to the question that I posed at the beginning, what are the consequences of this and was this good policy? I think there's some work that has been done by a couple of Labor economists in Australia, Bob Brunig from the ANU and his co-author Tristan Sainsbury, and they went to the tax office and they got data on the group of people who took this money out who were unemployed. And they studied the duration of the unemployment of those who had withdrawn from the early release scheme as compared with the unemployed generally. And they demonstrated that those who withdrew from their retirement plan stayed unemployed for longer than those who did not. So I think that and Bob Brunig would say, this is not a good policy outcome. And another reason that it's not a good policy outcome is that the retirement savings system is designed to provide incomes in retirement, but here it's being used as a fiscal stimulus measure. And so if you're a person who thinks that policy, one lever per policy, one instrument per policy, then using your retirement savings system to support short-term consumption is not good policy. There's some evidence, I think this is to be played out, there's certainly more work to be done to answer this question on whether lower savings and foregone investment returns turn out to be material. But if it turns out that this money was spent in perhaps in prudent ways and those savings are not replaced, then the burden falls on future generations to support the retirements of those people who withdrew these funds now in the form of means-tested social security benefits in retirement. So there's an intergenerational transfer potentially going on here, but of course all fiscal stimulus is an intergenerational transfer.
I don't know that conclusion from Bob Brunig. I mean, he's implying, of course, that maybe the unemployed who withdrew had idiosyncratic information. I'm not going to get re-employed for a while because the job site has closed down. Seems like a daft.
It's possible, but it's a lot of people.
Yeah, I know, but I have no idea how he could make that. They could make that.
Well, he does it. I'll leave it to you to read the paper, Glenn. I found the argument quite convincing. Anyway, the other thing that I just wanted to finish with is potential changes to mental accounts. So this is an issue. The Prime Minister says this is your money. You should have it now to meet your immediate needs. And if you think about this framed in terms of the purposes of retirement savings systems and the question of optimal illiquidity, the question then arises whether in future people will regard their retirement savings as a bucket of rainy day funds, and whether that matters to policy. Okay, I think I'll stop there. You might be interested in discussion about putting the money back. Basically, it's too early to say. People might be doing, but we don't know. And it's incredibly hard to identify. So people putting extra money in, we don't know why.
So there's a paper that I saw present at Harvard a couple of weeks ago where it's an experiment. So they gave money between $500 and $2,000 to people during the pandemic.
Oh, yeah.
And they also find that it took them, those who got the money, and this was randomly assigned, took longer to find jobs.
Right.
Actually, they don't find anything except, I think they don't find absolutely anything, no results.
I think I've seen that. Yeah.
So that might
I'll look
be
that up.
something that...
Yeah, I'll see if Bob's going to do it, yeah. Yeah, I really would like to study how people are putting this back, but if the only thing we observe are people's contributions, we really don't know the motivation. It could be that other shocks have occurred that lead them to increase their contributions.
There's a lot more going on in labour markets. People might be sort of changing vocation, they might be retooling, taking an MBA. That's something.
No, I agree.
Yeah.
But I'm saying this pattern is not, it's not the only paper. I have another paper that I have similar
The
results.
descriptive data is enriched.
Yeah.
I think the normative conclusions are just bogus.
But I agree.
Bob does have identification strategies in his study.
Sorry.
Bob Bruning's paper he uses identification studies so that he can make causal comments about
I want to push back on that because I saw Bob present the paper and
You don't think so?
he was very aware of the selections that are going on. He's not making causal statements.
All right, so I will switch to the discussion at this point.
Well, thank you very much to Philip and Glenn for putting on this. I assume Glenn was the other organiser. And Pierre Carl. Thanks for putting on a great conference. It's really been
been very interesting so far, and I was very happy to discuss this paper. Obviously, it fits very well with my research interests, being a fellow Australian and someone who does a lot of work on retirement policy. So just to give a bit of a summary, so obviously the pandemic and the associated lockdowns led to this really sharp increase in unemployment in many countries around the world, and so there was a lot of policy attention focused on how do we support these kind of workers during this difficult period when we have virus circulating, we have to shut down the economy. And so the Australian government, along with other governments in other countries, introduced these temporary policies where individuals were able to access their own retirement savings, which were previously very illiquid. So the policy in Australia was very interesting, as Susan explained very clearly. People could take out a maximum of $20,000 in two distinct periods. $10,000 was the maximum at each point in time. The paper has great data from the superannuation records of a large fund in the construction sector. Then it develops this survey, two surveys, one to people who took money out of the scheme and one to people who, from a general population, who didn't withdraw, and this is going to this allows the authors to study the determinants of withdrawals. So the paper was very clear. I think it's a very nice paper. I really enjoyed reading it, and so my presentation will mainly focus kind of more on just general context and what are the big picture questions that I think this paper really can give us some insights into. So superannuation, I think it's a really fascinating and important scheme. So it's quite unusual relative to private pensions in the rest of the world. It's very, very important, very large. So since 1992, contributions for employees have been mandatory. Initially, the rate was quite low, only 3% of your earnings, but now it's quite substantial. So 10% of your earnings must go into your own superannuation fund, and it's very illiquid, so you can't touch that money until retirement. So this is kind of a funded scheme, so it's not like a pay-as-you-go type system. So to some extent, what Scott Morrison said is right. It is your own money. Like this is coming out of essentially your pay, and you're being forced to save it. So if we take this argument that people are rational, as economists kind of often like to claim, then this seems a bit counterintuitive. Like, why should we force people to save a fixed amount of their income? Money should be kind of fungible. Is this kind of going to be welfare maximising? So we need to kind of assume that people have some sort of issue in self-control and ability to save for retirement. So it's now the fourth largest source of private pension funds in the world. So that's quite remarkable, I think, given Australia's population of only 25 million. I think if you did this per capita, I don't know the answer, but I'm guessing it would be probably the largest per capita. But Susan probably knows the answer to that. So what's kind of the big question here that this paper can kind of address? So I think the biggest question here is how liquid should private pension savings really be? In Australia, the system is basically such that they're basically completely illiquid until you reach the preservation age, and then they're extremely liquid after that.
Age?
Sorry?
We use that term, preservation age?
Yes. Yeah, that's the technical term in Australia.
Australian technical term, I love it.
Yeah, so currently it's extremely illiquid, and then extremely liquid. And so you may think that this is kind of not necessarily optimal. So in the work phase, it's basically because of this lack of liquidity, it's difficult to use this money to smooth consumption. So if you have a negative income shock, COVID happens, whatever, typically these funds can't be used. So maybe there's some sort of welfare loss from this lack of consumption smoothing. There's also some evidence in Australia that suggests that we may actually be forcing people to save too much. So then this is problematic as well, because we're basically, people would want to save less. They'd have a high marginal utility of consumption today and a lower one tomorrow. And so there may also be a welfare loss there. So What is this evidence? Well, one source of evidence is that many low-income people in Australia actually have an income increase when they get to the public pension age. So given that in retirement you generally need less consumption to maintain kind of the same standard of living, this may be suboptimal. So we also know that there's kind of no free lunch here. So to the extent that if we increase this contribution rate, we know that this reduces take-home pay today. So there's some really nice empirical evidence that shows that when the mandatory contribution percentage goes up, really this largely at a one-for-one rate, this largely comes out of take-home pay, which obviously makes sense economically. So thirdly, we know that intergenerational inequality is rising in a number of respects. So there's a growing gap in home ownership rate between young and old, growing wealth concentration at older ages, and a growing earnings gap between old and young in many countries. And so with all of this in mind, there may be a significant welfare benefit from allowing more liquidity in the system in this work phase. Then let's turn to the retirement phase. So after this, in this retirement phase, essentially it becomes extremely liquid. So you can take out all the money at once, blow it on the pokies, and then basically go on the age pension, the public pension. So there's potentially some sort of issue here that there's too much liquidity. So people may lack self-control, which is one issue. But then there's also issues with interaction of superannuation and the public pension in Australia. So in Australia, there's a very unique public pension system where it's means tested based on not only income, but also based on wealth. And so what this means is that for people in the middle class, there's actually a strong disincentive to have more wealth, because more wealth you have will lower your public pension. And this is a very large effect. So for some households, an additional $1,000 of wealth will reduce your annual pension income by $78. So that means that there's essentially you're getting an annual return on that additional wealth of negative 8% once you get to the public pension age. So there's a huge disincentive. And so we should really think carefully about whether we have kind of this optimal balance in two stages. So the results kind of imply that there's a strong demand for more liquidity, which suggests that for many, $1 in superannuation is worth less than $1 today. Some people may benefit from more liquidity. So this is kind of an implication, if we assume take this revealed preference argument, that people kind of really value this liquidity. So on the other hand, the paper shows evidence that these withdrawal decisions are not fully rational. So many people take out the maximum amount as soon as possible and don't seem to be carefully thinking through the implications. And also many people seem to withdraw right after the stock market plummeted. So I think this is important and could be kind of discussed more in the paper. But obviously that's important. So if we allow people more liquidity, one phenomenon that we may see is that people kind of panic when the market goes badly and take out all the money and essentially lock in their losses, which is a big concern with having more liquidity. So I think it would be really nice to discuss in the paper what the implications are for withdrawals following the preservation age. So as I said, you have a lot of freedom after the preservation age. There's no drawdown limits, basically. And so I don't know of much literature that's really looked at how people draw down. I think this is a really fascinating research question, actually. But maybe your results can kind of speak to the way people might behave and some of the potential issues here. So there's some other related work on the topic. I think in the presentation you did a really nice job of talking about this. I think in the paper, maybe it was because these studies are quite recent, but these weren't discussed in a lot of detail. But it would be nice to just explain what these other studies do in a bit more detail and what the relative contribution of this study is. I think that would be quite helpful. Maybe just skip these studies because we're running out of time. Yeah, so this paper is very interesting about the unemployment. We had a bit of discussion about this. So they use admin, tax and social security data, and basically they're comparing people who withdrew their superannuation, how long they stay on unemployment benefits, to those who don't withdraw. And they basically use some sort of matching to try and get it. My reading of the paper was they're trying to get it a causal effect, although it's obviously difficult with a matching approach. Thanks. So let me just go 1 minute over with Phil's permission.
I like that.
I think I was wondering if you can do more with the admin data itself. So there's a heavy reliance on the survey data in the analysis, but I think it would be nice if you can use this admin data to study more deeply who's withdrawing. So previous contribution history, whether someone's an active or passive saver, whether they're making voluntary contributions or not, would be interesting to see how that interacts with these decisions. Also kind of age, gender, account balances, investment choice, whether you're in a high growth or defensive type of account, might be interesting. Can you explore also more about when people are withdrawing? So you see these spikes kind of occurring at the start of these eligibility periods, but I was wondering if there's kind of any interesting correlation with the reasons why people are taking money out and when they're taking the money out. And also, obviously, this matters. When people take out the money, matters a lot in terms of the stock price here. So there's huge fluctuations during this period in the value of the funds. So I think it would be nice to explain kind of more what the implications are in terms of those losses. I think, yeah, showing the distribution of withdrawals directly might be helpful. So this is a graph from this other paper. They have kind of the histogram of these withdrawals. I think that would really illustrate the pattern. And I was trying to think about kind of some alternative explanations for what can drive this pattern. So we have this large mass of people who don't take anything out, and then a large mass of people who take out $10,000, with very little in between. And so I think the paper was kind of, the way I read it was that it was making this argument that there's some sort of sequential process that is somewhat irrational, where people choose whether to withdraw, and then if they withdraw, they choose how much, and then this $10,000 limit either provides a strong anchor or an implicit endorsement. So is there kind of some other story that could explain this? Well, there doesn't seem to be a large fixed cost of withdrawing. It's ticking a few boxes, as you said. But maybe there's kind of lots of heterogeneity in how much people want to withdraw. Like, how in that relationship between $1 today in your bank account and $1 in superannuation. Maybe that varies a lot, and you could see this kind of pattern. And the other thing I thought of during the presentation is there's kind of some option value here in taking out the full 10,000. So you can always put the money back in, and basically that would have no tax implications as far as I'm aware. So if you're kind of maximising your option value about your flexibility to use this money, maybe you should be taking out the $10,000. So that's another potential explanation. Let me finish here, because I've already gone 2 minutes over.
Those are good two premises, but if you have a few responses that you want to give, Susan, we have a minute or two.
Just very quickly, thank you so much, Todd. They're fantastic suggestions. And just one very quick comment on retirement withdrawals. I'm not sure if you've studied what happens in retirement in Australia, but although there are some effects of the taper that the implicit tax rate that you suggested, that particular group of people do apparently draw down faster. We have a much bigger problem with people spending nothing than we do with people spending everything.
I just had a question about the interpretation, and I think this is just an alternative that could be in the paper. It's not saying that you're wrong.
Yeah.
The conclusion was that people are not fully rational, as he was just saying, because they weren't thinking through the implications. Now that's basically got in the back of people's heads that they're allocating risk probabilities to those 4 outcomes that you gave them, and they got them wrong, is what you're saying, that they should have associated more to this one. I'm not questioning that. It's quite possible, however, that we have one of 2 things that are in the literature here. One is a big background risk, hence changing your foreground risk. Huge literature on effective background risk under many circumstances will make you more risk averse with respect to the foreground risk, ceteris paribus. The second is, and this is imagine the tokens. Imagine the tokens that had been allocated evenly. They had uncertainty. They couldn't allocate. There's so much going on right now. Then that's what we call uncertainty aversion. Yeah. I'm averse to the fact that I don't know. So either of those stories connect to very rich theory literatures, and I would love to see in the paper some space just given to here's an alternative interpretation. I'm not against yours.
No. I think they're great suggestions, Glenn, and I think the uncertainty story definitely going to be there, and probably heterogeneous across. We're talking about so many millions of people. I think lots of things will be going on, and you're right. We need to talk about the alternative stories. The one point I would make though is, in many ways, that background uncertainty and the heightened anxiety that everyone was experiencing at that time makes the choice of policy more important, because the degree of uncertainty makes the signal more salient in that instance. So, and honestly, I'd be surprised if anybody did more than wet their finger and put it in the air in choosing $10,000.
Well,
that policy was produced. So
we were in connection with Treasury through the Royal Commission. They didn't do even the bookkeeping.
not even testing the wind.
That's another.
Yeah, I know. So the consequences of that are really, I think that's important for policy making. Yeah.
So it seems to me that there's kind of two stories. One is uncertainty, and then households that are poor, and that therefore they needed the cash, and they use it to eat or to whatever they needed. But it was bad, and the vulnerable populations were. So yeah, it sucks that they use their savings, but maybe and they lost money on it if they took it when the stock market had dropped. But maybe they needed it to survive. So the other one. Sorry, the other one is very wealthy people that all of a sudden is this incredible opportunity to take out $40,000 of my pension tax-free, and that's nice. They might not need the money, but it might be wise to take it. And I don't know how it works, but maybe I'm ready to retire. I was going to take it anyway. I'll just postpone whatever I'm taking. But this is like $40,000 tax-free, and I don't know the marginal tax breaks, but in Spain it could be 30%. So
look, there's a lot going on, and the answer to the questions about the tax benefits, as I said, are individual. You'd have to almost person by person.
But you can do the analysis by income. So if you have
to make assumptions about what people do with the money they take out, and then what rate of return they earn on that.
Do you have the incomes? Do you have their income?
We have an approximation to their income that's based on their contributions to their superannuation fund, which is a very bad proxy.
But I would do the analysis you've done separately for higher income versus lower income, and see if there's any differential pattern in terms of interpreting, in addition to everything else.
Okay. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you so much. All right.